Rain threaded through the furs like wire, beating on canvas and wool, turning every boot print into a shallow bruise of clay. The forest held its breath. Somewhere ahead, a whistle snapped the quiet and a voice cut through the trees, short, clipped, unmistakably American. "Dress it on the left. Move." The consonants carried cleanly in the wet air, the cadence of a U.S. non-commissioned officer driving men uphill. Gefreiter Karl Weber, cheek cold against the bark of a fir, felt the command pass along the ridgeline like a tug on a rope. He had been told that the Allies in these woods were soft, that they bled morale when the rain set in. He had not been told that the voices would sound like this. Another call. Counted off, efficient, the vowels ironed flat by training. And Weber peered through needles slick with water. Between trunks he saw shapes advance by bounds, a dark thread weaving from tree to tree. In broken flashes he caught helmets slick with rain, web gear hanging heavy, the seesaw of rifles held low. The forest muffled distance. Sound arrived pure, image arrived late. Then, against expectation, a second voice answered the first, matching its tempo. "Hold your spacing, watch the cut." He understood the words and their intention, and it was the familiarity that unsettled him. Americans, certainly. Yet the faces that appeared and vanished at the edge of his sight were not what months of briefings had prepared him to expect. Down in the draw, Sergeant Ben Tanaka held 2 fingers to the rim of his helmet, then let them fall, forward. The signal was small, almost private, but his squad read it the way, months ago, they had read the posted hours of a mess hall or the printed times in a church bulletin, in towns where they had been strangers and still tried to be on time. The forest smelled of pine sap rising under the rain, of wet wool, of cordite that had not yet drifted away. He felt the damp grit between glove and stock and the steadying weight of the M1, a rightness that reassembled the world into tasks, and behind him, PFC. Danny Higa shifted the BAR into the pocket of his shoulder and listened for the rest of the line. He caught the echo of a runner's breath, the faint chime of a mess spoon he'd forgotten to stow deeper, the hush of rain crowding every leaf. The orders came in English, shaped to be heard. Hold, move, check fire, on me. The woods returned them, half a step delayed, as if the forest itself were learning to speak. They had been told what waited beyond the ridges. Texans cut off for days, counting rations, boiling the last grounds to trick the tongue. They had been told what stood between: wire, mines, trip flares that burned white in the rain, machine guns that found lanes even where there were no roads. They had been told, too, the things that did not fit into orders but traveled anyway. What it does to a man to be called less than his uniform, what it means to carry a rifle while someone you love signs a form at a gate back home. Tanaka measured these against the present facts. Trees tight enough to use as stepping stones, a logging cut somewhere left, a creek bed that bent like an elbow around the objective. Measure, decide, move. Weber adjusted the sling biting into his shoulder and felt, rather than saw, the change below, a hush that comes when men get close enough to smell each other. He waited for the argument of automatic fire to begin, for the long, scything bursts that told him the Americans were guessing. Instead, he heard a single voice. Close now, very close. Place a squad precisely, as if setting glassware on a shelf. It wasn't the words alone, it was the rhythm. He knew that rhythm from the other side of the line, from field manuals that sought to flatten accents and make direction travel. He knew it, and yet the mouth that made it, when it slid into view and vanished again, belonged to a soldier whose eyes were dark and steady above a face he had been taught to sort into another column. Clearing appeared as a smudge of light through trunks, a logging road gouged into the hill, buckled by roots. Tanaka lifted his hand, palm wide, and the squad sequenced to ground the way a flock will when a shadow passes. Higa's breath slipped into the rhythm of the rain. A murmur rippled over the net. A fire mission called somewhere behind them by a battery that had learned the shapes of these hills faster than maps could be printed. The shells came in distant and careful, a painter's underwash rather than a hammer. In its wake, the forest offered a gap. Nexpectation had sketched a different scene. Men floundering in the understory. Officers shouting to be heard, the sort of noise that lets a defender shoot where he remembers last seeing a man rather than where he is now. Instead, Weber heard nothing for 7 heartbeats, and then a single word that placed 3 men, and then another that placed 2, and when he risked a glance, he saw profiles, the brief gleam of a helmet rim, a shoulder sliding past a trunk, and then the forest went back to being trees. He did not plan the thought that arrived next. He did not even shape it into words in his head. It was the recognition of professionalism, where propaganda had told him there would be none. It was the stomach drop of a step on a stair that isn't there, and the way a man catches himself and pretends he meant to test the air. He swallowed and tasted metal and the dull residue of last night's coffee, gone cold in a tin cup that had not been rinsed. The whistle sounded again, not shrill this time but soft, like a teacher calling a class to order. "On me," the voice said, and Weber pressed his cheek harder into the bark as if the tree could learn to hide him. He felt the ridge under his knees, heard the small streams of water finding the grooves in the clay, and waited for the command that would follow, the one that would place the next piece. It came in the same tone he had heard on every training ground since conscription. It came in English. It came from a face that rewrote the map in his head. And his hands, with a will of their own, tightened on the stock as if to hold fast to what he had been told. And below, Tanaka lifted 2 fingers a second time. The squad rose as one, water falling from their ponchos in narrow cascades, and the forest answered with silence before anything else. The expectation had been chaos. The reality was cadence. They moved when the light turned the trunks into pillars and the fog into a low ceiling. Each step learned the slope by touch. Clay took their weight and kept a memory of the boot. A shallow oval that filled with brown water as soon as it was made. Packs rode higher to clear the brush, ponchos whispered. Straps clicked where metal kissed metal. Somewhere back along the axis of advance, an SCR set coughed and cleared like a man with a cold, then settled into the steady patience of a radio that knew it would be needed. Ben Tanaka checked intervals, counting without numbers. 1 trunk, 2 trunks, a downed pine, then a man. The map case under his poncho tapped his ribs with each step, paper softened by days of damp. He pictured the route as a series of shoulders, contour lines like the rings of a felled tree, each ring demanding effort to cross. The engineers had gone before them in the dark, shapes moving low with cutters and Bangalore sections wrapped in canvas, feeling for wire with hands that did not want surprises. Now the infantry passed through the holes they'd opened, careful not to snag a strap or trip the thin nerves of a forest seeded with alarms. Danny Higa adjusted the BAR so the sling stopped biting the same tender groove. He liked the sound of rain on the receiver cover more than he admitted. It made the weapon feel alive without asking for it. Somewhere to the rear, the 522nd Field Artillery tested a bracket, shells walking in beyond a ridge they hadn't reached yet. The sound came wrapped in the woods, a soft incoming hush, a hard thump, and then the leaves shaking off what they could not keep. The forward observer's voice on the net was almost conversational, as if ordering breakfast items. Drop 50. Fire for effect. They crossed a logging spur that had turned into a shallow creek, ties buried, water speaking a new language around their ankles. The taste of iron rose when mud splashed a lip. Someone swore softly, more out of habit than anger. In the next pocket of trees, a supply detail waited like stones in the landscape, ponchos thrown over crates that had once held hopes and now held needs. Bandoliers, K-rations, a few extra dry socks like found treasure. A corpsman traded a glance with Tanaka that said the aid station was only a ridge and a half behind, which meant litters would not have to fight every climb. In a small flat where the forest permitted stillness, the line took a knee. A runner came up, too young in the face and old in the eyes, and passed along a folded message protected by cellophane. Tanaka read it once, then once again because the fog smudged the ink, despite the cover. The words were ordinary. Phase line names, a time window, a reminder that the men disconnected ahead were counting on them while food ran thin. He slid the paper back, made the shape of a nod, and pointed with 2 fingers. On, left. At the edge of a cut, the 232nd Engineers reappeared, faces striped with muck, eyes rimmed pale by rain. One of them held up 2 sections of wire like a butcher, offering proof that the animal was dressed. "Mind the stakes," he said, and you could hear the distance in his voice. That tired place where a man speaks from after hours of work that invites punishment if he fails. Tanaka thanked him with a squeeze on the shoulder that was both permission and receipt. The engineer grinned without humor and vanished back into brush that recognized him now. They picked up the language of the hill, the give of duff underfoot, the treachery of wet roots, the false promises of game trails that bent the wrong way. The fog did not lift. It thickened, so every sound became local. Higa could hear the small chorus of his squad. Someone's breath, with a whistle in it. The faint clink of a snap hook. The dull thud of a canteen against a thigh. The forest pressed a finger to every lip. First contact did not look like the training films. It was a motion too tidy to be wind, then nothing. Then a whisper that did not belong to their side. Tanaka raised a hand, and the squad unspooled laterally, each man finding a tree as if he had planted it himself. The first rounds came quick and cautious, feeling for them, a stitcher's test on a scrap of cloth. Higa counted 3, single shots from somewhere uphill, and replied with a short, heavy sentence from the BAR that tore a slice of bark from a trunk and sent its smell into the air. The smell of wounded wood is clean in a way that makes a man feel both forgiven and accused. The firefight lived in the understory, low and close. It was not an argument of volume. It was placement. Tanaka moved men by inches, made the forest their ally, fed the line clarities it could use. 2 bounds. On the stump. Hold. Watch your right. In training, cadence had been a chore. Here, delivered in that flat, careful American English that stripped away flourish, it was a rope thrown into a river. A cry went up from somewhere left. Pain. Then the tight swallow of a man mastering it. The litter team arrived as if conjured, sliding past with knees bent, keeping the stretcher steady over the uneven ground. A corpseman knelt in the muck at a ranger green sleeve darkening with blood, tore open a morphine ampoule with teeth, and slid a triage tag under a rig strap where someone could find it in a hurry later. He spoke almost to himself as he worked, not to soothe, but to keep his hands on time. Fight tilted, as fights do when one side understands more about the ground in the 10th minute than it did in the first. Tanaka saw it. The way fire from ahead lost its certainty, the way the pauses grew longer. He leaned close to the radio, asked for smoke, and the 522nd obliged with a gray curtain that learned the folds of the trees and draped itself where men were most exposed. Under that cover, squads bled forward by yards that mattered. And Weber was there, somewhere up the slope, recognizing none of their faces and all of their methods. He had listened for a mistake and did not hear it. He had prepared himself to be comforted by confusion and found none. His section leader hissed a direction, and Weber took it, sliding behind a log that promised 1 good minute and no more. At the top of a shallow draw, the teams paused. The forest arranged itself into a geometry that made the next decision obvious. A logging road cut across the face, offering a crossing that was also a killing ground. Higa tasted old coffee again, found the BAR's front sight with an index finger to clear the bead, and waited for the voice that would stack the move the way a careful man stacks dishes. Fog breathed out and in. The rain turned fine, more suggestion than insistence. For 7 long seconds the world was composed of heartbeats and the drip from needles. Then, close enough to feel it in the ribs, a command came, neat and level. "Online! 2 and 2! Covering fire on my signal." Higa glanced at Tanaka, who gave the smallest nod a man can make and still be seen. From somewhere ahead and right, lost in the whiteness, Weber froze, head turned toward the sound. He had expected shouting, the improv of panic. What reached him was NCO cadence as precise as a metronome, spoken in American English by soldiers whose faces, when the fog thinned, would upend the arithmetic in his head. The cut opened like a wound in the hillside, fresh earth, torn roots, a skid of wet clay that made knees bargain with ankles. On the far side, spruce stood tight as pikes. Smoke from the 522nd clung to the ground and then thinned, showing only what a careful man needed. Tanaka put 2 fingers to the brim, then leveled his palm. The squad spread as if hinged from his hand. Online, 2 and 2. covering fire on my signal. The words fell into the fog and came back quieter, like a lake accepting a stone. Higa set the BAR into the earth, elbows square, cheek to stock. The sights framed a notch of trunks and the suggestion of a helmet brim. Rain ticked on the receiver in a patient way. He could smell the metal, the faint, clean tang of oil warmed by work, under the taller smells of crushed fern and old cordite that the forest had not finished forgiving. Somewhere behind, a kettle lid clinked in a mess kit someone had tied badly. The tiny sound made the space feel human and temporary. Weber lay behind the rotten heart of a fallen log, the bark gone to pulp under his wet sleeve. He tracked by sound now, a soft bootfall where the ground rose, the damp swish of a poncho on brush, the pause that means a man has found his breath and is about to spend it. When the American voice came, it was not a shout but a placing. Now, cover. Higa's BAR spoke in short, heavy phrases, the rounds walking a waist-high seam to keep heads where they were. 2 riflemen ghosted the crossing, low and quick, the mud giving way under each heel and taking an imprint as if to file it. Jabber's section leader raised a hand to show he understood something unspoken, then took it back too late. Fire sewn to the ground stitched the air ahead of him. Bark leapt. He stayed still, shrinking, felt rain find the inside of his collar, and waited for the American mistake, the too long burst, the rush into a blind. But the voice below organized silence and noise into a shape that fit the hill. It had weight. It had the absence of fear that comes with practice. "In hold," Tanaka said, and the squads held. The cut was a throat. You did not run through a throat without first teaching it to open. He raised his hand and dropped it, and the grenadier's arm drew a neat arc, 2 dull pops in the tree line. A scatter of torn needles came down like green rain. Move. They went 2 by 2, Higa's fire stitching a sleeve of sound for them to slip inside. At the far bank, boots found purchase in gouged clay. Fingers grabbed at what roots would loan, knees learned the new angle. Higa's breath fell into the rifle cadence around him, single shots placed like pins, a bow phrase, a long inhale of quiet to learn what the forest had to say back. On the right, a shape flinched. On the left, a helmet rim blinked. Higa tapped the sight and pressed the trigger until the tree between them agreed to be cover. First German to show himself did so with both hands, as if he were bringing something to a table. Helmet off, fingers high, he stood into the drizzle with his mouth open, saying nothing. Another followed him a heartbeat later, and then Weber, who had rehearsed defiance in his head and could not find it in his hands. The voice that reached them was the surprise, not its words, which were plain, but their home. Hands up, Schritt nach links, move left, slowly. The English came first, shaped by training. The German arrived functional and without contempt. The face that delivered both wore a U.S. sergeant's chevrons dark with rain. The eyes steady, the jaw set not by anger but by task. Weber had been told a story about men like this, that they were not exactly Americans or not enough, that they fought for reputation rather than country, that their discipline wouldn't hold when the forest began to take people. What stood before him contradicted without argument. The sergeant's hand, open, steady, directed him with the same economy it used to move his own men. No flourish, no theater. Drop it there, step back. The rifle left Weber's hands the way a fever leaves a body, sudden, shocking, entirely. A corpseman came forward on a knee, the red cross on his brassard darkened to an umber oval by rain. He scanned faces the way a mechanic scans gauges. At the second man, he reached up gently, turned a temple to the light, and found a crease leaking behind the hairline. He tore open a dressing with his teeth, blew mud from a cheekbone, and wrapped the gauze tight enough to hold without making a show of pain. "You'll be all right," he said, not to comfort, but because patients stay quieter when told what their bodies already know. He fixed a triage tag under a suspenders, strap where the rear would see it, before the man fell asleep. Noe watched the hands. They were efficient, even kind, but mostly efficient, and the efficiency read as respect. Not for him personally, for the process that would carry him backward out of the fight and forward into captivity. He had expected to be shoved. Instead, he was guided, 2 fingers on the elbow, a human compromise that kept everyone moving. The guard assigned to him, short, soaked, with an American helmet riding low, spoke once in poor schoolhouse German and then switched to English, as if placing both of them in safe territory. This way, slowly, and HIGA rolled his shoulders and let the BAR cool, muzzle smoke thinning like breath on a cold morning. He could feel the pivot more than see it, the way the hill no longer pushed back as hard, the way men moved without flinching at every twig. He looked toward the POWs out of the corner of his eye, and then looked away, not from disdain, but because attention belonged uphill where the job still was. The forest rewarded the discipline by staying a forest and not turning into a story they would rather not tell. Nautica checked his watch under his poncho, read a time that meant the day had been both long and insufficient, and raised the handset. The net gave him the clipped calm he needed. 1 cut secured, pushing to the next spur, 2 EPWs moving rear. He nodded at the guard detail. Treat them right. We've got more work. Weber. Walking backward through a narrative that no longer fit. Past the engineer's stake line he had ignored an hour before, saw where the wire had been clipped like a ribbon, and understood the sequence as a whole for the first time. Engineers laying patience in the dark. Artillery painting with caution. Infantry speaking in a grammar that made people move. It was not the thunder that undid him. It was the cadence at the collection point. A shallow fold with a poncho stretched between 2 saplings. The corpsman poured water from a canteen cap, swished blood from a mouth, and tucked the man's tag so it would not wash away. Someone handed Weber half a chocolate bar without looking at his face. Someone else adjusted the blanket over a wounded American, without mentioning that both blankets looked the same in the rain. The world had shrunk to simple acts that did not negotiate dignity. Behind him, the squad stepped off again. Higa checked his sling and found the tender groove. Tanaka lifted his hand. The forest afforded them one more narrow corridor. Weber felt the tug of the line moving forward, even as his own path sloped back. He understood in that moment that he would recall above all else the sound of a Japanese-American sergeant giving orders in American English, not the shots or the shelling or the rain, but the voice that told men where to be and how to live. The guard pointed with 2 fingers, the same shape Tanaka used. "Keep walking," he said. "You'll be processed. Food soon." The word food arrived as a promise he had not dared make to himself. He did not answer. He listened to the cadence recede into the trees, and in its place he heard his own breath, measured now to match what had moved him without touching. Daylight never really arrived. It just thinned the darkness enough to name shapes. The forest settled into its working noises. Breath, straps, metal, the quiet arithmetic of men counting what they had left. A runner traced the line with small corrections, boots whispering in fern, passing on the same 3 facts at each stop. The aid station had shifted forward 1 fold. Ammunition would meet them at the next draw. The artillery had a new bracket that should spare the exposed knuckle ahead. He carried these not like words but like tools and set them down gently with each squad. Ben Tanaka kept the map case tucked under his poncho as if it were a warm animal. The paper inside had swollen with damp and softened enough to accept a pencil without protest. He sketched the ridge the way a man draws a face he's come to know. The stubborn chin of granite, the high cheek of sapling growth, the crease where water liked to rest. Companies B, I, and K stacked their movements along that profile, 1 to feel, 1 to hold, 1 to push. Trading roles the way tired men trade jokes without requiring them to be funny. Far behind or near, depending on how the woods bent sound. The 522nd Field Artillery worked in a rhythm that ignored the rain. Their shells wore soft shoes in the air and firm heels at the ground, each detonation adjusted by voices that refused to rise. Forward observers slipped between trunks like a rumor nobody wanted to own. Shift left 50. Danger close. The batteries made the forest take sides. When the thump died, you could hear needles settle like a crowd deciding to sit. And at a choke point where the hill insisted on its rights, the 232nd Engineers had left their handwriting, hand-over-hand cuts through wire, stakes flagged in a color the rain could not wash to nothing, a line of white tape that led around a minefield the way a mother leads a child around a puddle when there are church shoes involved. An engineer with mud dried like paint on his cheek tapped his own ear and then pointed to the ground. "Listen," he said, "and if you put your palm to the earth, you could feel water moving under it, choosing paths men would need to cross." Danny Haiga learned to drink hot coffee one lidful at a time, the heat trapped and rationed by habit. The taste lifted the tongue and set it down again. He shoved the cup back into a pocket where it would slosh against his ribs and leave a warm stamp he could pretend was armor. The BAR rode his shoulder as if they had been born together. He looked at the men to either side and saw the small repairs each had made to his day: tape around a blister, a sock turned inside out to pretend it dry, a string of rosary beads looped under a shirt so the cross would not clack on a buckle at the wrong moment. Contact came in brief, convincing flashes, an exchange of views rather than a debate. The enemy was there in the way a hand is there behind a curtain. The shape was enough. Tanaka moved fire the way a careful cook moves heat, never letting it scorch the edge where the sauce thins. Short bursts. Stitch the seam. Hold your right. Higa worked the BAR in a language that satisfied the weapon's need to be useful without indulging it. Spent casings ticked on stone and vanished into the litter like coins into long grass. They passed a litter team hauling against gravity with patience. Boots angled outward for grip. One of the bearers wore a chaplain's cross blackened on the chain, and when the ground evened for 3 steps, he tilted the canteen cap to a young man's mouth and named him in a voice that held the syllables like they were breakable. A corpseman crouched in the stump of a tree, penciling on a triage tag made greasy by rain, the graphite holding fast. The tag went under the strap where a future set of hands would find it without rummaging. There was no sermon in any of it, and therefore more comfort than if there had been. At a small fold where someone had convinced the forest to be a room, a supply sergeant had spread a poncho over crates and called it a counter. He handed out bandoliers as if dealing cards to men he knew well, which he did. 1 apiece, 2 to the BAR. A box of socks sat there like a rumor of civilization. He let each man touch it with his eyes before shaking his head and saving them for the next rotation to the rear that would not come soon. From a pocket he produced a biscuit tin that rattled and shared the last of the hard candy without noting who went without. Tanaka took nothing and inhaled the smell of sugar the way a man reads a postcard and never writes back. Between pushes, the forest offered instruction. Where the ravens clustered there would be meat by afternoon. Where the ground wore slow water, boots would go slick when the rush came. Where the wind ran fingers through the upper branches, the smoke from a cigarette would betray a position. Men absorbed these lessons wordlessly and turned them into small choices that added up to living. Weber moved rearward in increments governed by other people's plans. The guard at his elbow was courteous by default rather than intention, which made it feel less like a favor being granted and more like a system working the way a system ought to when men are captured. At the POW collection point, a kettle steamed over a blue flame shielded by mess tins, and an American private with mud to the knee poured broth into a tin cup as if the cup had earned it. "Careful," the private said, and then turned the same word to an American stretcher case with exactly the same tone. Weber did not yet have a place to set the kindness, so he put it in the same pocket as the shock of the voice that had ordered him to live 5 minutes earlier. Up front, a forward observer hunched behind a stump slick as bone and spoke like a man dictating a letter to someone he loved and needed to spare. "Repeat, add 20, smoke on the right draw." The 522nd gave him what he asked for, and the hill changed how it looked at them for 3 precious minutes. In those minutes, the squads did what squads are built to do. They made distance out of nerve and muscle and the kind of luck that comes to people who prepare. By afternoon, the rain surrendered to a mist that settled in collars and made every breath visible. The ridge ahead stopped pretending to be anything else. It lifted its back like a cat and dared them to touch it. Company B tightened along the left, where the slope bit into the sky. I Company drifted toward the middle seam, where a game trail offered the illusion of permission. K Company held the right, watching the ground for the sort of hole that holds both water and men. Tanaka traced their alignment with a glance and felt the structure drop into place like a bridge paneling home. Talk on the net grew spare. Words cost more when the end of day threatens to be the end of something else. A Texas voice cut in, dry, even through rain, passing a bearing at a distance that made sense in the mouth of a man who had been starving for a week and still found the compass. "We're here," he said, not pleading, not boasting. "If you're heading north of the cut, aim short of the dead spruce. You'll smell the stove before you see us." Higa smiled without meaning to. He could imagine a stove where a stove had no right to be, could imagine the thin stew that tastes like feast when the counting goes bad. He flexed his fingers and felt the grind of grit in the glove and the slick of oil on the trigger. Around him, men settled straps and checked each other's collars the way mothers do before church, making sure nothing would flap or snag or betray them to the air. The forest opened a fraction, enough to show a scrap of pale sky lodged between two dark shoulders of spruce. That small light measured the last climb better than any map. Tanaka lifted his hand and brought it down. B, I, and K shifted in a way that looked like agreement more than order. The last ridge waited with its own private weather. Somewhere beyond it, men who had been counting crackers by halves set a pot where steam would tell the truth. The day chose sides again. They stepped off, the earth accepting each boot as if it had practiced for this moment. The expectation had been that the woods would drown them in confusion. The reality was that they had made a path out of repetition and care. The scrap of sky widened, just enough to suggest the color of evening. Orders arrived with a damp, folded, smudged, ordinary. They did not announce heroics or promise relief. They told time where to be and men where to stand. The 36th Division pressed the 442nd forward with a pressure that felt like a hand on the back. Firm, not unkind, not negotiable. The maps showed only ridgelines and draws, but the tone of the net added what the paper left out. The surrounded Texans were rationing hours as carefully as food. The calculation was simple even when it wasn't fair. Push now, accept the bill later. Ben Tanaka read the fragment twice, sheltering it under his poncho, and felt the arithmetic settle behind his ribs. He knew the unit's limits almost by smell. The moment when wet wool soured into a warning, the angle of a climb that turned thighs to questions, the sound a man's breath makes when he's using tomorrow to pay for today. He closed the case and looked along the file. Faces were the color of the forest now, eyes rimmed pale, lips creased white where the cold had licked them. Yet when he raised his hand, the small muscles at the corners of those eyes lifted, the telltale flicker of attention. Orders, received and understood. He slipped a letter from an inside pocket, while the lines stacked for the next move. The paper had softened to cloth with the rain. It was from Wyoming, a place his boots had never touched but his heart knew by shape. Rows of tar paper barracks, wind crossing flat ground without asking permission, guard towers learning the names of families. A smudge marked the bottom where a fingerprint had found ink and left its quiet proof. The words were bare of complaint, weather, health, a neighbor's kindness with spare cloth. But his mother's hand had pressed harder when writing the line about winter coats. He folded the page back into its small shelter. The hill did not care about the letter, but the hill would learn that the man who carried it had room for more than one duty. Danny Higa tamped down the bar sling, freed a thread that had wound itself around a swivel, and listened to the radio's low, patient breath. The net had grown lean. There were fewer voice prints now. Men pulled out for wounds, runners who had not returned, a forward observer whose silence said he had moved farther than the wire wanted to admit. What remained was professional and close. Hold 2, smokin' 30. A reply. Copy. 2 holds. He thought of the first time he had said copy in training and how grown-up it had felt. Now it felt like a hand signal refined into a word. The pressure from above was real, but it arrived through people who carried its weight with care. A Battalion S3 did not appear from the trees with a speech. The runner did, cheeks raw from wind, bringing the same 3 lines he had carried all morning, and one new one that tightened the schedule by half an hour. Tanaka felt the change as a notch cut into a metronome's wheel. The beat now a shade quicker, the space between breaths narrower. He nodded and sent the runner on with a squeeze to the forearm that acknowledged both message and messenger. Policy traveled here too, in its quiet way. The Geneva Convention lived in the red crosses on brassards, in the way aid stations made room without asking who had worn what color on the ridge, in the triage tags tucked where hands could find them with a certain kind of love. It lived in the guard's 2-finger guide at a POW's elbow. It lived in the fact that the word prisoner on the net sounded like logistics, not vengeance. Meanwhile, at the sharp end of operations, the doctrine of combined arms moved on wet boots. Engineers had already taught the ground to yield in narrow places. The 522nd would soon lift fire to the next fold. Infantry would close the distance the map made look smaller than it was. Tanaka tasted pencil on his tongue from biting it while he drew, a habit he would not break now, and sketched the next bound. The ridge rose with a lip that would hide machine guns until a man committed. An architect's trick, an ambush written by geology. He spoke softly to Hyga and 2 riflemen, placing them like thumbtacks on a corkboard. Left of the game trail, short of the dead spruce, cover the angle that makes knees want to bend. Short bursts, he said. Think of the next minute, not the last one. Hyga nodded and looked right, past the trunks. He could sense more than C Company B shading up to the flank, K Company holding the seam with a patience that read his courage because it refused to rush the picture. He thought briefly of home, of a kitchen where steam fogged the small window above the sink, and then dismissed it with tenderness, because memory makes men careless if it becomes a place to live. He listened again. The forest had a pulse that matched his chest when he let it. Weber had learned a different pulse, stepping backward through an order that spared his life. At the collection point, blankets were blankets, cups were cups. Men recognized fatigue first and nationality second. Guards rotated not to be kind, but to keep the system honest. A chaplain wrote a name carefully on the corner of a wet tag so the man attached to it would not become an arithmetic problem in a rear tent. Weber watched this and held 2 truths in opposing hands. That war had asked him to believe one thing about these men, and that the last hour had insisted on another. The push waited on one more turn of the screw. The forward observer's voice came through as if cupped in a hand. Shift smoke to the saddle. On my mark. The 522nd's reply was the sound of preparation, a net tightening, a count reaching its chosen number. The rain dwindled to a thread. The fog began to lift in shreds that caught on twigs like wool. Figures resolved into men. You could see the darker band where packs had soaked through jackets, the pale semicircle of skin under a helmet rim that would be a sunburn if the sun had a vote. Tanaka let himself consider the strange double of the moment. Here was a regiment whose parents signed forms at gates, whose sisters learned to sew from women who had learned to ration the bright parts of life. Here were those same sons, mud to the knee, asked to spend themselves in a French forest for Texans they had never met and would never live near. The arithmetic did not require poetry. It required competence. He checked his watch. Time answered impatient in, up, he said, and they rose. Engineers, tape guided the first steps, then the ground decided again. Hyga gave the BAR its voice. Not loud, not long, enough to teach the enemy to look where it was safest for them to look. Rifle shots added punctuation, small periods to stop the other side's sentences. The line advanced by the length of a breath held and released. The net cracked with a tone everyone knew. Not panic, not triumph, contact that mattered. A voice edged with Texas found them through the trees, plain as a sign on a highway. We see you. North of the cut, it said, each word walking carefully. If you swing 10 degrees right of the dead spruce, you'll hit our foxholes. We've got a stove on. Hyga blinked, seeing the image before his brain caught up. A blackened pot breathing steam into a world that had forgotten about it. Tanaka felt the line lean forward the way a team leans into a harness when the wagon crests a hill. He put the handset to his ear and heard the battalion net choosing where to place the last hands in the last minute of a long day. Contact friend. Texas boys ahead. Someone said, not on their frequency, but close enough for the words to climb down into their bones. Tanaka lowered the handset and looked at the ridge. The sky beyond it had pale in it, as if the day planned to end after all. He lifted 2 fingers. The forest made room. The last ridge broke not with a shout, but with men arriving in each other's lives. The forest thinned into a ragged lip. Beyond it, foxholes pocked a slope where earth had been taught to be a wall. Faces rose, hollowed by a week of counting crumbs, bearded in patches, eyes set deep and bright. Steam lifted from a blackened pot like a hand making small promises. For a breath, No one moved. Then a Texas drawl came across the narrow distance. Patient even now. "About time," the man said, and grinned with the corner of his mouth still strong enough to manage it. Ben Tanaka felt the line loosen in ways a body cannot plan. Shoulders dropped, chins lifted, lungs took a full measure. He stepped down into the foxhole and found a captain with a week's worth of stubble and a clipboard that had become part of his hand. They shook, and the shake lasted longer than either had intended. 141st 1st Battalion, the captain said, voice sanded down. "We thought we had another night." Tanaka glanced at the pot and the thin stew making the right smell at the right time. "You do," he said, "but not alone." Men folded into the perimeter the way a seam closes under a practiced hand. Packs slumped. Rifles found safe angles. Aid men did their quick arithmetic. The stew tasted like salt and warmth and the idea of meat. It burned tongues that had forgotten what heat could do. Cups knocked gently as if mindful of their duty to be quiet. Higa eased the BAR to a rest and took his turn with the pot lid, using it to keep the rain from softening the only hot thing in the world. A Texan beside him, cheek hollow, helmet pushed back, tilted his cup, and said without ceremony, "Thanks." The words struck like a nail driven true. In the near woods, the war continued in fragments. A probing burst that found no answer, a shell far off that had missed its hour. But inside the circle, men borrowed minutes. A medic cut away a sock with the delicacy of a tailor. A chaplain wrote a name on the dry corner of a tag and tucked it where it would be read. A sergeant counted heads aloud, and then under his breath to be sure. The rain thinned to a mist that made breath appear and hang. Voices stayed low as if speaking too loud could wake the forest's worse ideas. Noeber reached the POW cage as afternoon leaned into evening. It wasn't a cage so much as a geometry. Stakes, wire, a field kitchen nearby, a ledger on a table under a poncho. The guard who had walked him down peeled away with a nod a friend would understand. A corporal with a pencil behind his ear and a register that had seen drier days asked for his name in German so careful it sounded like a courtesy. An interpreter, Nisei, rain dripping from the brim of his helmet, stood a step away and offered English when Weber stumbled. "He's asking family name first," the interpreter said, and it took Weber a heartbeat to understand that this man had just bridged a gap he did not know how to cross on his own. Soup line did not distinguish. Ladles made the same arc into American cups and German cups. Bread, gray and good, went out by halves, then quarters when the line stretched. A private checked a label on a can twice, making sure a man with an allergy did not borrow trouble on the day he had escaped another kind. Geneva lived here, not in speeches but in inventory. Blankets counted and recounted. Water boiled the extra minute, tags legible even after the rain. Weber wrapped fingers around tin that stung with heat and watched steam find a path up. He thought of the log, the bark soft under his sleeve. He thought of the voice, American, measured, that had told him to move left and had meant live and up on the ridge. Relief took a shape that looked like work. Litter teams mapped a route less steep than the shortest one, because men on stretchers understand every angle. Runners carried bearings and nicknames. Dead spruce became a coordinate. Stove became a landmark that no mapmaker would dare write and every man would know. The 522nd shifted its attention to the folds beyond, smoke walking in to keep eyes elsewhere. The 232nd Engineers returned to the places they had tamed in the dark and beefed them against a counterpunch that might still come. Tanaka wrote the date with a pencil that refused to break, the 30th of October, 44. He wrote it on the corner of a message and on the back of his glove, and in his head where dates live when paper fails. The number settled him. He would remember the day later by its work, the hand signals, the cuts in the wire, the stew, but the date would be the frame that kept it square in memory. He looked to his right and found Higa with the BAR's receiver open, wiping water from metal that had learned the shape of his hands. "You good?" Tanaka asked. Higa nodded and scraped a bit of grit from the extractor with the tip of a matchstick. "Good." A soldier from the 141st came along with a box that had once held mortar rounds and now held letters bundled by string. "Mailbag," he said, with a humor that survived on purpose. Been reading these to each other by lantern as fiction. He held one out to Tanaka without looking at the name, and for a second, Tanaka imagined it would be from Wyoming, stamped with a camp postmark, the paper warm from somebody's pocket. It wasn't. It was for a corporal 3 foxholes down who could not quite get his fingers to work the knot for the string. Tanaka passed it on and felt the ache that comes when a hope is both foolish and not a sin. And Weber, warmer now, listened to 2 Americans arguing in low voices about the right recipe for cornbread, as if the forest were a kitchen and the rain a rule they would break. The interpreter smiled at the argument and translated only the gist. They are discussing food. He explained, stove up. A Texas word Weber decided was both noun and verb. The interpreter's German was good enough to be kind and imperfect enough to tell the truth about who he was. "You will be moved soon," he said. "The paperwork matters." It sounded like a benediction from a man who had not set out to be a priest. Night approached by degrees. The mist darkened, the trees accepted shadows. Breath fog thickened to small clouds. Perimeter watch bills were drawn with a style learned from fatigue. Those who had just eaten were set to first watch to spare those whose hands were shaking from hunger. A pot lid clicked down and was nested into another as if dishes could conclude a day. Somewhere to the east, a string of shells walked away into someone else's problem. A staff sergeant with a voice like a metronome stepped through the perimeter, checking weapons on safe, fingers on triggers straight, helmets strapped. He spoke in that same American cadence Weber now understood differently. "Stand to," he said gently, which is how you say something hard to men who have earned a soft edge. "We're not done." The words belonged to him and to every NCO since the Army discovered what it takes to keep men alive. The accent carried no anger, no triumph. Only duty. Final quiet was made of small noises. Spoons sliding into pockets. A cough surrendered and then suppressed. The click of a safety verified by touch alone. The hiss of wet wood refusing flame. Tanaka looked to the left and right and saw his line as if on a map he had drawn as a child. Straight enough for pride, ragged enough to be true. He let himself picture Wyoming for one breath. A doorway, a room with 2 coats, a stove, and then set the picture aside the way a careful man sets a precious thing where it will not fall. He wrote the date again, small, the 30th of October 44. Higa blew across the bar's chamber and closed it with a sound that had become the day's period. At the cage, Weber finished his soup and stood when told, stepping where the guard's 2 fingers pointed, guided into a future that was not a sentence so much as a direction. And in the dark that followed, fog lifted from the firs in pale veils. Men in both circles, rescued, rescuers, prisoners, slept in increments calibrated by duty. And if anyone woke in the small hours, they heard the forest breathing, and, under it, the memory of a voice counting them forward. Not rumor, not threat. Cadence. American cadence, spoken by Japanese-American soldiers in a French wood, on a day when myth gave way to work, and work delivered men to each other.